Welcome to D, your go-to podcast for candid conversations. Dive deep with us into the heart of life's challenges, business hurdles, and the journey to better ourselves. Join us in exploring the art of living intentionally, finding balance, and enhancing not just your life, but your business and leadership skills. It's time to grow, to inspire, and to lead, and D. Conversations that transform.
Welcome back to D, and I'm Dave Evans, and this is
Debbie Halls-Evans.
Winner of 2 TV shows, Debbie. Debbie, if you didn't know, in the other seasons, Debbie's won a home interior design show and a cooking show, didn't you?
I did.
Anyway, in case anyone's missed that. So, Debbie, what are we doing today?
So today, Dave, we're going to be talking with a guest about what leadership or leadershit has been their experience, means to them, their perspective on it.
And this whole season is about the book Leadership or Leadership, isn't it? And Leadership 2.0. I almost sounded really bad with my phonetics there. So we're going to be going back to, throughout the series, people who were interviewed previously, aren't we?
Yes.
We're going to then talk about the chapters themselves,
Yes.
aren't we? And then people like our guest today, as I drop my phone, people that like our guest today, they're going to come along and talk about real challenges that they're facing with leadership right now, or have done in the past, or any other iteration. Is that true?
So just repeating what I've already said, it is somebody else's perspective of leadership or leadership and their experiences.
I did
with
totally
it.
repeat it, didn't I?
Yeah, you did, yeah.
But it's a 3-time convincer, at least, to the listeners, isn't it?
Yes.
So, Debbie, who's here today with us? Who's our guest?
We have Brian Smith. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Deb.
Welcome
Hi, Dave.
to Easter Sheehan.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we want to do, I'm going to let him introduce
one
himself.
second. I just want to use a Brian phrase. You ready? Cool.
That's funny.
It is. There you go.
Well, I haven't picked that up anyway. So, Brian, rather than us talk about what you do, I actually think it's always better for Dave not to tell us what you do, is you share what you do and why we're even having this conversation together.
Well, what I do is help people realize their influence, which is leadership. Everybody is a leader, which I'll get into a little bit. But I do that through our company, IA Business Advisors, and our body of thought work, which is called the IN Team series, which currently is 2 books and soon to be 3 books.
Exciting. So in regards to where people can find you, because I think this is really important, because one of the things that we have worked out is that we have a very similar ethic and value around sharing and actually being present for other people.
We have a synchronistic view of the world.
We have it's a really good word, synchronicity.
Correct.
Where can people find you, your business, your team?
The best place is online, obviously, so iabusinessadvisors.com. On all the socials, and you can also find us under the name the IN Team series.
Yeah.
And then I have an Instagram account, which is Influence Author.
Okay. So we'll just make sure they're all attached. As well,
what
so
does
people
IA stand for?
Individual advantages. And
Wow.
it goes right along with what we're going to be talking about, which is our influence and leadership with that influence.
So at this point, you haven't read Dave's book because he's only just given it to you.
Yesterday.
Right.
I got it yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're not going to talk about that because I actually think we've spent the past couple of days with you and we're learning so much, which is really exciting. So talk to us, what isn't leadership for you?
Yeah, well, what leadership isn't to us are people, one of the biggest things is people who don't do as they say. And that we think is probably the number one indicator of somebody who is struggling as a leader, where they tell people what to do, but then they do just the opposite, or they don't quite hold themselves to the same standard of expectation. And that's our first inclination of what leadership is. Yep. Leadership is any person, doesn't matter who you are, where you're at, what you're doing, who is doing their best in whatever area of influence they find themselves and influences others. Which means everybody has the potential to be a leader.
And you talk about everybody being a leader. So because there is another part to you as well, is you've built a business not just only on tech, but also psychology and understanding the human behaviours and how we all operate. So knowing that as a leader, because we always prefix it with self-leadership, because it starts with the individual first. That's how we've always talked about it. So talk to us, because this is a real important topic for me, is everybody has the capacity to be a leader, even if they're sat in a space right now listening going, well, I'm not a leader. How do we, using influence, actually let that person understand that?
Yeah, well, I think first, we are synergistic in that you have to be your best self first before you can be your best in any other situation. So one of the best examples I have is in one of our companies where we have a warehouse manager who said, I'm not the boss. And I had to explain to her how in her area of influence, the warehouse, she is the leader. She sets the rules, she manages the environment, she knows where everything is, where everything goes. And she never really thought of herself as a leader in the context of what traditional leadership is. But when we put into context what their influence is on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis and what those responsibilities are, they become enlightened that even the smallest influence to others is a huge influence to another set of others.
Yeah.
And what might be inconsequential or even unremarkable to one is amazingly consequential and remarkable to others. So each of us in our own particular area of influence is likely a leader. And if not, if you're in a total servant position, somewhere along the way you will transform into a leadership posture, and that influence will start to project itself.
I really love what you described there, Brian, about sitting with somebody in your team, so if you're listening, and stopping and looking at it from a side view and showing someone where their influence is, how it shows up, no matter how good it is at this stage, and what the influence is. That's great, isn't it?
Is there something more about that? So if I don't understand my own influence, but I have somebody else's perspective, the leader in that scenario, so not the one who's working out their own influence and leadership, is that person's perspective is we've then got to also allow that person to expand on what that influence is themselves, because they might see something we don't see.
Exactly.
You know, I think the warehouse manager is a really great example of that. Is I could say, well, this is this person's definitive leadership influence, but actually when they then reflect on it, because it's been brought to their attention that they actually are the leader in that area, is they'll say, well, also this and also this. And I think that to me is the opposite of what leadership is, because we talk so much of that's ego driven. I'm responsible, you'll do as I say, you'll do as I do. We don't listen to other people. So I think that's really, for me, really important. It's good for us to have the conversation, but we've got to let that other person expand the next stage of that conversation.
Right. Yeah, they have to not only realize it, but accept it. If they don't buy into being a leader, they will not act as a leader. And they could quickly go past it if you don't do it correctly, as you just noted. You can flip to the ego side. And so if you don't influence them properly, for me as the leader of the whole organization, if I don't empower her and mentor her and give her the support and energy she needs to be a proper leader, she may develop, instead of a leadership, which also to me is called a boss.
Yeah.
You know, and we don't want bosses. I don't think anybody really wants bosses. And nowadays that's quickly turning into a negative title, not the positive title it might have been to others in the past.
Yeah.
I think it's a really, really great lesson just in this first part of the podcast today about really thinking about showing somebody where their influence is, helping them understand it. But the other thing you just said, if you're listening, is about getting someone to buy in. Have you ever had a situation, Brian, where someone didn't buy in? We don't need to know who or where it was, but how did you handle that? Because as a leader yourself and your influence, the IN team, handling that right's important too, isn't it?
It is, and it actually happens very often. Some people just don't want the responsibility of leadership.
Yeah.
They don't want to have any accountability for whatever reason. It could be something that happened to them in the past. It could be their upbringing. And that's really why psychology has become such a huge part of our practice, and why we start most of our engagements with a psychological foundation and an understanding of the individual human's that we are working with, because then we know best how to approach our guidance for them and help them look at themselves in a mirror, look at what they do, listen to learn from those around them and from themselves, and either develop that leadership posture, or oftentimes we have to move them somewhere else. We have moved people in our organization out of a traditional leadership role into another role. But one of the things that goes with that is an understanding that even as a person who may not have responsibility for decisions, may not have responsibility for anything that looks like leadership to them, they still provide leadership support and actual leadership to others through their influence.
Yeah. So I want to go back to, because that's really important, that we're all influencing something. That's actually ultimately, even when we think we're not, we are. I want to go back to, because we had a really good discussion about this, and it's important because it's something we've talked about, is the profiling. So I have a very, very strong opinion on profiling, and it's from experience of people sitting within that profile and becoming that profile, because ultimately every profile means that the individual is self-assessing, and we know that we can distort that. Now, you used two very clear ones, and you gave a really great explanation of the biases, and I know it's in the book as well. Book one, bias, is it in book one? The biases?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah, there's conscious bias, unconscious bias, and subconscious bias, which are three very, very different biases that we have, and there's a reason for each of them. So we do explain those in the book. I'm happy to expound on them. They can get a little complicated. I can try to make them simple.
Well, I think I understand the biases, and I think we just get people to buy the book. Yeah. But I think there's a bit about me in regards to the profiling and why and how you use it to the benefit, rather than it being seen as because it can be weaponized, right? It can. I see profiling can be weaponized. I'll give you an example. I didn't share this one last time we spoke about it, but I worked with a client who had got the team had gone through the disc, and it was red, and they were red. Is that disc?
No, that's CI.
Strength.
That's emotional insights.
So they were red anyway, so it's a different profile, so apologies. But they were red, and this person then said they had this horrific interaction with this person. And it actually really distressed them. They really struggled with it. They actually ended up being quite ill over it. And their explanation was, well, it's okay because they're a red and they're meant to be like that. And I lost it at that point, really successfully. But you've given that person permission to continue that behaviour, justify and validate it, because actually that's not what that profile was about. It was about the actual person understanding their influence because of these traits that they may exhibit. It wasn't to use it to their benefit, that I can now bully you or I can make you ill. But you gave a really good explanation of how you use profiling, because you even have it on your email signatures as well, so other people can explore it.
We do, and so the entire history of our company, as we've dealt with humans, we've used DISC. And we used DISC initially because it was it's environmentally influenced.
Yeah.
Okay, so the DISC review that we get back is influenced by your current environment, which can also mean external, home, friends, family, and your work environment. So when we give it, how we give it is very important, and explaining that to people ahead of time is very important. The other one that we use is Colby, which is your cognitive, basically it's the DNA of your behavior, but what it doesn't say is how you behave. Yeah. What it says is what your tendencies are. For example, fight or flight. We are all built with fight or flight. How we act when we feel fight or flight could be contradict the feeling. So I might want to run, but I fight, or I might want to fight, but I run. That's what Colby does, is it tells us what that initial instinct is at different parts of our cognitive behavior. We use them both because it helps us to build better communication strategy and tactics within teams. Yeah. It also helps people understand each other better. So when conflict comes up, for example, if you're with a D in DISC, that means they're dominant, right? Okay. And if you are a C in DISC, you're conscientious. And if you're dealing with somebody and you see somebody's dominant side rise as a conscientious person, we give them tips to communicate better, collaborate better, and we give the DISC tips to understand their behavior and the conscientious person's also. And we use that as part of our strategic and tactical engagement with our clients.
And how do I then, so if I have my DISC and my Colby, how do I then as an individual, because understand how I influence that? Because I think that's the really important part as well, isn't it? Because I think this is about, you said, a pre-explanation, a during explanation, and a post-explanation. This is not just a, here, go and do this survey, there's your profile, right, off you go. I think one of the things I got from you was, this is about an ongoing, regular conversation around how you deal with these.
Yeah, it's a process. So when we do the assessments, it's about an hour to an hour and a half per person. It's 20 minutes of the assessment.
Yeah.
The rest of the time is diving into the assessment. After that, we dive into the assessment of all of the people that you have touch points with. And by a touch point, I mean somebody that you collaborate with, communicate with, that either influences you or you influence them, or you might even influence each other through whatever areas of influence that you work with each other. And then we talk about how, first of all, we talk about, do you see conflicts in your communication? And then we give context to how those conflicts are driven by either DISC or Colby, what their tendencies are, what they're feeling. And we validate that by asking a lot of questions. You know, when you're dealing with so-and-so and they do this, maybe they're domineering, does it make you feel this way? Well, yes. Well, let me explain why that happens. And then it brings context to the assessments. And then we say, you can try this or try that through your next touch points. And through trial and error, because again, these assessments are about either environment or about what your tendencies are, people still react differently. And even when they get this knowledge, sometimes they fight it, they disbelieve it, you know, so, and we walk them through all of that. And what we're not trying to do is turn them into somebody we want them to be. What we're trying to do is turn them into somebody who looks at themselves and thinks more mindfully and purposefully about the influence they have on those that are around them and the influence that they receive from those that are around them, and create a more transparent, communicative infrastructure and engagement place for the teams.
I think that's the greatest thing in listening to you both talk about this, is that this is about shared intention and engagement, and stepping towards a conversation and being more self-aware that when that conversation goes, or dialogue goes a little bit squiffy, there's an insightful word, right? That you've got a way back. And it isn't a moment where I fall out with Debbie. Imagine, that never happens.
Never happens. We never disagree. Ever.
No, or Debbie falls out with me. It would allow... That doesn't happen ever. No, not at all. Perfect harmony all the time. Is that it gives us a set of tools to use and a set of insights to use to bring us back to a conversation where you can reset that intentionality and move through it, rather than, I guess, the opposite in leadership, Brian, is where people don't use those data analytics, those insights or tools, and they end up stuck for ages. You know, I'm sure you've come across this also, where departments are described as working in silo. What they mean is in combat. They're actually not in silo, they're combating with each other or competing internally, as opposed to being a unified business competing in their marketplace.
Got a question then. So it's just popped into my head as we're talking about this. So I believe that the reason why profiling for me is that hasn't been, well, I've never experienced it positively, and I've never seen other people talk about it positively. So this is the first time I've ever heard somebody talk about it in a really beneficial way.
Yeah.
So, and I think the reason I see it is that people then allow themselves to be labelled and defined. So even in this conversation, what makes a good leader, what's a shit leader, you know, actually there is still a slight definition of this is an example of good and bad. Well, actually there isn't good or bad, is there? It's what is. So using the profiles, we're not saying that there is a certain type of person with a certain profile is a good or a bad or indifferent leader. What we're saying is that actually look at this information and see what you influence as an individual, and actually then you become the leader that is you.
Correct.
Right.
And we don't use it. One of the rules we have with us and with our clients is you never use an assessment pre-hiring. You never assess prior to hiring. The reason we do that is that you have a tendency to label prior to hiring.
Yes.
You try to fit the round peg in the round hole. You tend to steer towards what you think these assessments tell you is the proper person. And that's dangerous because, as I've said, what you see is a snapshot of either an environmental influence or a genetic influence that doesn't necessarily equal how they are.
Yes.
It takes that added conversation, that added transparency, that added engagement through the learning process of learning to be humans together and to develop relationships and collaboration together to fill in all the blanks and help them to realize themselves and help you to realize yourselves as a new individual. Because as I haven't said to your guests or to your audience, individual to us is little I, big I. The three of us together right now are an individual team working together to educate.
Yep.
So as you learn to grow from little I to big I, that's the path that's exciting through assessments.
Debbie, I'm really excited.
Well,
Have you noticed something?
what?
Brian talks like I do.
Yeah.
Have you heard what he's saying?
What?
Humans.
Oh, humans. Yes, he does talk. Yeah.
Isn't that marvellous?
That is marvellous. That's
And,
more
and Brian's a
simplicity.
doctor.
Yes, he
Brian's a
is.
doctor, Dr. Brian Smith.
Yeah.
And Dr. Brian Smith is saying humans. I know, that gives me hope for my future.
Indeed.
Maybe my influence one day when I grow up.
Yeah, you are very grown up.
Thanks, Debbie.
Yes.
This is a great conversation. I really love that distinction that you just gave, which is utilizing the tools, but also not using them before hiring. That's
actually
that's a
a
brave
huge takeaway,
statement.
yeah.
I know lots of people who don't do that. They actually recruit to the assessment tool. And I can see why that's dangerous. And I'm now thinking about clients that we have that use those tools, and if they're even listening today, because we know some of them very intimately, how many people have you hired based on that tool that stayed with you? I'd really like to know the answer to that question, and we'll go and find out in between our podcast recordings.
Well, I think there's more to this. This is about, and how you're sharing it is, this is about a continuous investment in the people within your business.
Exactly.
And this is about never actually sitting with that person saying, you must. It's actually, it's that, like you said, it's this collaborative, continuous conversation. I think that to me is collaborative, continuous. A bit of alliteration there as well.
Collaborative, continuous cooperation,
Conversation.
synchronistically.
No, that's with an S.
No,
Dave,
it's with
that's
an
not a
S.
C.
I'm excited.
We just had an assessment for a client, and it came. So one of the Colby assessments that can come back is what's called in transition. Now remember, this is an assessment of your born cognitive genetical foundation.
Yep.
Yet it came back as in transition. So we followed it up with a DISC review,
Yep.
which told us what was going on environmentally. And then we said, well, let's wait and see till you settle. And once you settle, let's reassess. What happened was they were in distress over coming out of a very toxic work environment, which influenced the assessments and caused them to assess as in transition. Once we got them into a place where they felt more balanced and they felt more accepted and they felt like they were back on their feet, we gave them their assessment again, which then gave us a true snapshot and allowed us to then help them integrate into their new environment in a way that was healthy for everybody. And it helped them to accept the fact that they had just went through this toxic relationship in a work environment and that they didn't have to carry it with them. That they had a way of overcoming any potential conflict by being self-aware and understanding maybe where they contributed to the toxicity, where they were participating in the negative influence. It might be through reaction, it might be through proaction, but they got to assess that. They got to learn that, and we helped them through that through the assessment process.
That's really cool. Now, the other thing I do want to talk about, because I like this one as well, and it's another connection that we've got, is the I and we.
Yes.
Because I hadn't noticed that it was in I, hadn't noticed.
I, you, and me.
We.
We.
Yes. let's explore that, because it's a big part of influence as well, and also and how you function and work with your teams. So tell us about what the difference between I and we and how it fits under influence.
Yeah, so as you know, my pronouns, they're
Yeah.
not really pronouns, but I have chosen them as my
Yeah.
pronouns in LinkedIn is I and we. And to put it out really simply is I am the culmination of every we to this point in my life. So I am always we. And that's how we build our relationships, is how we build our approach towards our clients. We teach them that they are accumulatively what and everything that they have experienced. And that doesn't mean that if you've experienced bad, you're bad.
Yeah.
But it means that you have been through that, and what you do with it is now up to you. And how you approach what's in your we is really up to you. You can't blame them.
No.
The point is you've taken it away, and if you mimic bad behavior, you can't blame it on somebody else now. You've allowed them to become part of you to influence your bad behavior, and now you own that.
Yeah.
And what you are doing is passing that on to somebody else's we. So I am we is all of us, just like you pointed out. And I don't feel like I'm ever, I mean, when I even talk about myself, people will say, why do you always say we?
Yeah.
I say, well, because whatever I'm going through right now was influenced by others, you know. And I think the only time you can't really say that is the moment you're born.
Yeah.
But that changes 2 seconds later. And it never changes. I mean, it never stops.
Yeah.
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 I just think, to me, that's just really exciting to hear, because I think we get to the point of, and let's go back to leadership and leadership, is that if we understand I and we as this combined element, is that you can't ever be leadership then, because you're always in a point of self-seeking, understanding what your responsibility is, understanding how you influence other people.
Yeah.
I think it literally is kind of self-affirming, I suppose. That's how I see it.
Yeah. I love, you might remember this when we spoke together this past summer, where I asked the audience, you know, when did you start influencing?
That's right.
And a lot of people didn't get it. And we had a handful who did. They just shouted it out.
Yeah.
And, you know, we begin influencing before we're born, which means that you are already part of other people's lives and you haven't even taken a breath yet.
Yeah.
You know, the moment our parents find out that they're going to have us, we've changed lives. And not just their lives, probably their parents' lives, maybe their brothers and sisters' lives, maybe even their workmates' lives, because they're making plans now for maternity leaves. I mean, we're influencing and we haven't even taken our first breath.
Yeah.
That's the power of influence,
Yeah.
in understanding ourself and that we matter, because we do matter.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm a firm believer in everybody matters, but I think that's how I see or societal leadership is that person's better than the other person, right? So I'm a leader, so I'm better than you. Goes back to your boss statement. I'm the boss, just do as I say. You know, and actually the minute you start doing that, or you see that, and then you choose that path yourself, because it is a choice to follow that path, is you then separate that I and we instantly, don't you? And you allow somebody else I call it give permission to. You give permission to somebody else to influence what in the negative. Is there a negative? I don't know. I challenge myself on that all the time. Is there a good, bad, positive or negative, or is it just is? Don't know.
I think you've done a really good interview so far today, Debbie. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sitting here
thanks.
learning loads.
Right.
I'd like to ask a question to Brian about our perceived planned collaboration and why he thinks and smart might be cool, right? And so we're sat around here today not really fully knowing where we're going to go with this, but we got some great intentions. Before we segue into that, Brian, I want to just highlight to people listening that the we is really important, because in the RLC leadership principles 3 and 4, so number 3, that's confusing.
That's very confusing.
Right? So leadership principle 3 is remove obstacles from the people that you serve. So we helps you think that way. And then the other one is, number 4, is enable your people to act. That's also we-based thinking, right? So it's a really great insight if you're listening to this. I'd also like to ask you another question before I go back to the other question, which is typical Dave Evans style, where I make this mistake, Brian. I make loads of mistakes. Debbie will tell you. She's looking at me if you knew. Yeah, of course he does. Is that Dave will always say, I'll ask you one question, and there's usually three, right?
Or five.
I think you should come back at the end of this season, having read the book, done a peer review for us, and then we'll revisit Leadership and Leadership, the actual book itself, later on to finish this season before our exciting new season that will come along after that. But the question is, why Anne Smart? Because you've been a huge influence with us already. What's your thinking around that? What excites you about that? And candidly, what else would you like to say?
Well, I think first is tell your audience what SMART is.
Well, that would help. Yes, Dave.
So,
yes, tell them. Yeah.
So, at our company, we teach SMART management, which was born out of SMART goals. If you don't know what SMART goals are, it's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic or relative, and timely. And we've always felt that to create a SMART goal is to create a place somewhere in the future. But what it always lacked was, well, how do you get there?
Yep.
So we developed in our area of influence what we call SMART management and SMART communication. And it's just like it sounds. It's developing tactics and communications that are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And you can't have the art without the SM, right? So specificity and measurement drive attainability, realism, and timeliness, period. Where SMART and is so exciting is that it doesn't matter where you're at. You can always say and SMART and it goes together. You can be having the biggest problem in the world and apply SMART and it'll come up with a great solution together. And together they really will solve, in what I believe, and I think you all do too, predominantly most of the issues that we face as individuals in whatever area of influence we have. And what's so powerful about that is it's not ours, it's theirs.
Yeah.
It gives them the power individually to apply very simple practices, internally and externally, to overcome challenges that we otherwise have been beating our heads against the wall with or against other people with, and come out on the other side positive and productive and moving back in the right direction. That's why I'm excited about and SMART.
Yeah.
Were you impressed with how he said specificity?
I do, yeah, because it's one of those that
I get that wrong all the time, and I thought, and it's like watching, you watch like ice skaters, Debbie, at the Olympics, and they go off and they do a big like multiple twirl stunty thing at the very beginning, and they land it. And they could have done it halfway through and they relaxed, but they go up front. You nailed it right at the beginning. That was impressive. See, there we go. It's gone.
Yeah. Anyway, move on.
But you did it with gravitas. But no, I love that. We were excited too. Who knows where that will go? And we'll tell you as our collaboration together synchronistically continues throughout the next few weeks and months and the year ahead. But is there any lasting message you'd like to leave somebody with as a thought that's important to you today on the podcast?
I literally always leave this thought. I don't care where you're at, what you're doing, digging ditches, running the whole company, somewhere in the middle, you matter. And in your life, you have people who don't feel like that. One of the best things you can do for self-fulfillment and the fulfillment of others is to help them understand that they matter. Put into context their value. And their value is way more important than they think it is. Because generally speaking, life doesn't move forward without everybody helping along the way. I don't want to bag my own groceries. I don't want to pull my own food. I don't want to paint my own house. I don't want to, all of the things that we take for granted in our life, the moment we wake up to when we pick up a computer to whatever it is, somebody was involved in that. So whatever you do, you matter. And embrace it. And if you don't like it, find something else. That's the takeaway.
That's a mic drop takeaway.
Debbie, what are your thoughts before we bring our podcast episode to a close?
I think, and the thing that I've really genuinely enjoyed is the I and we, hugely important. And I think it's a great place to start to sit in understanding what do I genuinely influence and then asking people. Because I think that's the other part, is never assume your influence. Actually go and find out what it is. Because I think that was a big learning for us last year when we actually asked our clients that question.
Huge, yeah.
Never done it before. Why? No idea. But anyway, we asked our clients, and it was a revelation in regards to us coming into building and I just think it's a really great way of thinking. And I think that's how we should model leadership.
100%. And we would like to thank you, Brian, for spending this time
Yes.
with us. It's been absolutely magic.
Thank you for having me out here. It has been, well, magical is really the right word. It's just been an amazing few days. Thank you.
Yeah.
And as you close this episode out,
As you or we?
as we close this episode out, Leadership 2.0 talks about asking the big question, which is, how do I change to help the we? And therefore, if you're listening back to this, there's so many good things in this episode to just stop, think, and consider, and then, most importantly, do. We'll be back in the next episode with more great insights to share with you. This has been &D. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to &D. For ongoing inspiration, follow us at @Scott on Instagram and online. Keep going, keep inspiring. Until our next episode.